Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Centre for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI as we say. My name is Fred Kuntz. I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs here at CIGI. I'd like to thank our public event sponsor, Wordsworth Books, for their ongoing support of CIGI's signature lecture series. Thanks also to those joining us from around the world through our live webcast. Following this evening's address, we welcome questions from the audience, either the live audience here at our microphones in the aisles, or from our online audience through the chat function on your screen. Please remember to state your name and to keep the questions brief. Investing without concern for your return may sound like weak financial advice. But as venture capitalist and economist William Janeway may explain this evening, an innovation economy depends on this kind of risk. Successful ideas are often found in the midst of costly failures, mistakes, and missteps. An innovation economy depends on long-term visionaries prepared to invest today in an idea that may not yield any gains in their lifetime. Tonight we'll hear more about the innovation economy and the investments it requires. Dr. Janeway is currently a senior advisor at the private equity firm Warburg Pincus and director of Magnet Systems, Nuance Communications, and O'Reilly Media. He also lends his time and expertise to several economic organizations, sitting on the executive board of the Social Science Research Council, the Cambridge Endowment for Research and Finance, which he and his wife Wesley established in 2001, and the board of CIGI's long-term partner, the Institute for New Economic Thinking, to name a few. Dr. Janeway is also a respected economic writer, authoring chapters and articles on capitalism and social research, and most recently writing the book, Doing Capitalism in the Innovation Economy, Markets, Speculation, and the State, which forms the basis for his lecture this evening, and also will be available for purchase later in the foyer. He'll be glad to sign a copy for you. Dr. Janeway is a pioneer and a generous supporter of economic research, a friend of CIGI. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished guest, Bill Janeway.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you, Jim. And let me tell you what a pleasure it is to be here. It has been one of the most enjoyable and stimulating days I've spent in many a time, and that's that's in competition with teaching some of what, or perhaps a superset of what you'll hear tonight, over the last several months at Cambridge University and Princeton University. I think Waterloo and CIGI is in very good company in challenging and creating an environment for interesting and provocative dialogue. And I hope that's what I can provoke this evening. So let me begin by suggesting that what I learned by doing capitalism is going to have a broader resonance with respect to how we think about the dynamics of the innovation economy. So the first question is, what do I mean by the innovation economy? I mean a set of processes through which economic development has been driven by technological innovation for some 250 years. Upstream, processes of scientific discovery, technical experimentation. Downstream, the exploration of new economic space as hopeful monsters in a kind of Darwinian mode spring up in the soil that is created when new technologies are deployed at scale. And both of these processes, this is critical, both of these processes proceed by trial and error and error and error. In between, the technologies that really matter, that reconfigure the architecture of the market economy, have been embedded in transformational networks, networks of infrastructure from the canals and railroads of the first industrial revolution through the electricity grids and highways of the second great wave of technological transformation and onto the internet. Networks whose value and use cannot be known at the outset of deployment. Now, all three of these phases depend on sources of funding, necessarily sources of funding that are decoupled from an immediate concern for economic value. And there are two such sources, two reservoirs of capital available for these kinds of investments: financial speculation, bubbles, and a mission-driven, politically legitimate state. Now, despite the heroic myths of Silicon Valley, the history of United States venture capital illustrates exactly what I've been saying. From 1980, when something resembling an industry emerged from what had been a small craft practice scattered across from Boston, around Boston and New York, when an industry emerged, since then, in every year, more than 80% of all the dollars invested by members of the National Venture Capital Association in the United States have been invested in only two industrial sectors: information and communications technology, the digital sector, and biotechnology, life sciences. Those happen to be the two sectors where, over the previous generation, the federal government had invested literally hundreds of billions of dollars constructing platforms on which entrepreneurs and the venture capitalists who backed them could dance. It also is the case that the VC industry emerged, grew, thrived, prospered during the greatest bull market in the history of capitalism, between 1982 and the blow-off of the great dot-com telecom bubble in the year 2000. You can see here the extraordinary inflation in the number of firms and in the amount of capital committed to those firms that moved in step with the growth of the bull market into the speculative explosion of the bubble of 1998-2000. And then you can also see what has happened since. In fact, venture capital returns are very closely correlated with the performance of the public equity markets. They are not an independent asset class. What I'm showing you here is called the PME, the public market equivalent. This is constructed, and it's now the standard way of evaluating every private equity fund, from startup venture to buyouts. You look at the historical record of a fund. You look at the pattern by which money was put into the fund from limited partners, pension funds, insurance companies, and when the money came back to the limited partners. And then you take the same amount of money on the same day and put it in the public stock market index, where you have complete liquidity and you're part of the overall market. What this shows is that for the 200 funds that I and my collaborator studied, funds in which, all of the funds in which two of the leading research universities had invested since 1980, funds that collectively were substantially better than the total industry average, that it looks like the average return from these funds was 1.6 times what you would have got from the public market. But when you take out the small number of highest performing funds, the top decile, the top 20, you would have done just as well investing in the public market. And if you look at the median firm, the one that's 50% right in the middle of the distribution, you'd have done just as well investing in the index. Now that's the cross-section over 25 years of venture capital investing. And it also, we showed that it was access to the public market, to a public market that was animated, that really made the difference to fund performance. Here we're looking at taking each of the funds we studied, we're weighting them according to what the conditions were in the IPO market when the funds exited. If the conditions were poor, like they have been for the last 14 years, that is less than 2 in our scale, the median return was 9%. When we were in the bubble environment, better than 3, it was no less than 76%. The venture returns were not independent of the public market conditions, and this shows the time series returns
in the same way. That's again the public market equivalent. During the bubble, the weighted average returns were extraordinary. You were doing 2 to 3 to 3.5 times as well as the public market. But when the bubble collapsed and the IPO market closed, since funds raised in 1996, this line shows that you actually would have done better investing in the public stock market index than investing in the venture capital funds. Venture capital is not the magic bullet, which, independent of either government investments beforehand or public market speculation at the time of the investing, it's not an independent source of driving innovation. It's embedded. Now, let me take a look at the, by the way, this just confirms, these are the venture capital index calculated for the National Venture Capital Association versus the NASDAQ. And you can see that you have to go back 15 years. You have to go back to 1999 to see outperformance of venture capital at the time of the peak of the Great Bubble versus the public market. Speculation and the state, the two sources of funding for innovation. Now, let me put this into a broader perspective. Bubbles didn't begin in 1998. Wherever there have been liquid markets and assets for hundreds of years, going back to Amsterdam and tulip bulbs in the 1630s, Britain and the South Sea Company in 1720, wherever there have been liquid markets, there you will find herding behavior, momentum investing, and the opportunity for financial speculation to create an environment in which capital can flow rapidly back and forth from the public markets to the real economy where investment in real assets takes place. John Maynard Keynes, and in some sense I am an intellectual descendant of his, I studied at Cambridge under his leading student. In his general theory, Keynes had an insight which has been lost to economics and is now in the process of being rediscovered. It's what I call Keynes's bridge. The valuation of financial assets drives the movement of the volume of investment in real assets. When financial assets appear to be undervalued, there's no sense, as he put it, in building a new enterprise if you can buy a similar one on the public market. That's the leverage buyout game. And contrariwise, a new project, you might spend an extravagant sum if you can take it public, as we could in 1998, 99, 2000, at an immediate profit. Now, the underlying way that bubbles, financial speculation, mobilizes capital at a scale for risky projects, for projects whose return cannot be known, for innovative networks, and for the hopeful monsters that grow up that are founded to exploit those networks, those new economic spaces. The motivation is simple. Investors, particularly professional investors managing other people's money, cannot afford to miss the wave. And they have the opportunity, they can believe that they can win even if the underlying project fails, that there will be a more enthusiastic, a more speculative investor in the market. And they can hope to get out before they have to find out whether what they've funded has any economic value. Now, the objects of speculation stagger the imagination. They range across an enormous spectrum. As I say, tulip bulbs, gold mines, silver mines, commodities, sugar, wheat, and on the other hand, every kind of real estate. Commercial real estate, residential real estate. Occasionally, the object of speculation has been one of those enormously significant new technologies that, when deployed at scale, changes everything. This shows the real economic impact of the great dot-com bubble of 98, 2000. What you're looking at in the black line is the R&D spending by American companies less than 15 years old in the technology-intensive, science-based sectors of the economy. You're seeing the dotted line, the dashed line, is the cash flow, the total cash flow they had access to. And as you can see, it goes from about $6 or $8 billion to $80 billion at the peak of the bubble, driven by the thin line, which is the amount of money they were able to raise in the public equity markets. The bubble eliminated the financial constraint on new companies investing in innovative projects. And when the bubble burst, the cash was no longer available, and R&D spending started a long trend back downwards. Now, bubbles always burst. They always burst. And the ones that really cause trouble are not what happened here. This, in the liquid capital markets, in the equity market, in the stock market, whereas money is made on paper, money is lost on paper, the impact on the real economy has been very limited. The impact in 2001 and 2 was entirely different from the impact of the bursting of the great credit bubble in 2008. And this bubble left behind the fiber that carries the internet. It created the environment in which Google and Amazon and eBay were founded and prospered and funded at a scale that would not have been possible other than through this kind of speculation. When the focus of speculation is real estate or silver mines, and when it infects the core banking system that provides the working capital on which the ordinary economy of production and consumption of employment and income depends, then the results can be catastrophic, and what's left behind are those abandoned beach houses in the Nevada desert of no economic value to anyone. So you think of bubbles along a matrix of where is the speculation taking place. If it's limited to the public markets, the damage when it bursts is likely not to be so bad. And if the object of speculation is technology that offers the opportunity to transform the production possibilities and the productivity of the economy, what's left behind may be a net economic gain. Now let me turn to the role of the state. In pursuit of politically legitimate missions, state investments have driven economic development for more than 200 years. The dirty secret of development economics is that when the challenge is to catch up with the leader, mercantilist policies work. Mercantilist policies, very simple. Appropriate available intellectual property wherever it can be found and however it can be found. The British discovered how to make textiles from the Flemish, the Italians, and the Indians. We discovered it from the British. The Chinese have read the book and are doing a great job of appropriating available intellectual property. And then, as the new industries are created, protect and subsidize them. This is how Britain became the first industrial nation. The great German economist Friedrich List, neglected because his message was not what those committed to free trade, which the leading country can afford because it is the most productive, neglected because of that. So he wrote, had the English left everything to itself, laissez-faire, no government interference, the Belgians would still be manufacturing cloth for the English, and England would still have been the sheepyard for the Hanseatic League, instead of being the leading industrial power of the early 19th century. The US and Germany challenging the UK through the 19th century, Japan and Korea versus the US in the 20th century, and now, of course, China, are all following the same game plan. But there is a huge challenge in moving from being the follower to being the leader. The same institutions, the national champions, that have followed the proven path to economic development, laid out by the leader can become the enemies, the barriers to innovation at the frontier, to driving the frontier of innovation forward. One little anecdote. Back in the 1970s, the most powerful opponent of the government programs that were constructing the basis for the internet and that were proving that what was called packet-based switching of messages could work, a novel approach. The most powerful enemy was the company that perhaps more than anything else had been the driver of America to industrial leadership in the first half of the 20th century, AT&T. The national champions can become the barriers to innovation. Now, in the case of the United States, national security provided the needed legitimacy for state-driven technological innovation through a variety of different modes. As the Cold War emerged, the Defense Department undertook first funding research on a very broad basis, not only to private companies and far beyond the scope of government-owned laboratories, but above all in creating the research universities that had barely existed in the United States before World War II. Second, there were direct spin-offs into the civilian world so that all of the technologies that were developed around semiconductors, around computer hardware, around computer software were immediately relevant and available to commercial application. Most neglected, however, is the role that government has played as an early, collaborative, and creative supporting customer for the products of new technologies that are not yet ready for commercial prime time, pulling the vendors down the learning curve to reliable, low-cost production and making it possible to enable the spillover into the commercial market. Something that the Defense Department did that was remarkable and unique was to invite purchasing from new companies, from the Intels and the Texas Instruments, not just the IBMs and the AT&Ts. It was the first customer for these new companies. Now, the other contribution, and again, very distinctive, and today it appears radically contrarian, was the Defense Department insisted on an open, virtually an open source system of knowledge sharing. If you took money from the government and did research, you were obligated to license it on a fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory basis. That means you had to license your competitors. If what you sold to the government really mattered, you would be required to put a second source into production in case you failed, so that there would be continuity of supply. Software wasn't even patentable in those days. The diffusion of this new knowledge allowed for access by new companies that didn't have the resources to do fundamental research, but that could take advantage of what was available and innovate more rapidly than the large-scale incumbent established firms. And this is what led to the US taking the leadership in the digital technologies from the silicon infrastructure through to the software applications, starting out, in fact, behind Britain in 1945. Britain chose the path of trying to enable national champions in each of these sectors, and that was a profound mistake and one that we can learn from going forward. Now, since we've only had one instance so far of leadership at the frontier changing, and that was from Britain to the United States during the course of the first years of the 20th century coming out of World War I. We don't have a lot of data. We don't have the basis for saying how to do it right. I'm going to address the question of where we are now in that respect. But in constructing the basis for U.S. leadership, the role of national defense as a legitimizing mission spilled over from the direct contributions to military capabilities into other domains. Following Sputnik, not only was the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, the father and mother of the internet, created, but the interstate highway system, massive federal investment in constructing a new network across the country, which transformed the architecture of the economy, was passed into law as the National Interstate and Defense Highways Act. Now, it was actually a requirement that as the interstate highway system was built, every bridge had to be high enough so that a carrier, a multi-wheeled carrier with a first-generation intercontinental ballistic missile, could move across the country as if they were going to be moved around. But it was the legitimizing rationale of national defense, just as with the National Defense Education Act, the first direct funding of by the federal government of higher education, again rationalized in the language of national security in the context of the Cold War. Governments correcting market failure in the classic mode of welfare economics, market fail that creates a basis for government to intervene, has played a relatively trivial role in mobilizing public resources for investment in innovation at scale. It has been these transcendent political missions, of which perhaps the extreme example came in 1971, when President Richard Nixon declared war on cancer and led a massive increase in funding for the National Institutes of Health. Now, when he declared war on cancer, that was not just a play on words. By invoking the language of war, it legitimized funding science by evoking a mission that transcends economic calculus. No one did cost-benefit analysis on the mobilization leading to D-Day or the retaking of the Pacific Basin from the Japanese. It's not subject to prior restraint by cost-benefit analysis. So there's a kind of double externality from this sort of national mission. On the one hand, it legitimizes state investment that increases the potential production capacity of the economy. On the other side, it addresses the concern that Keynes raised back in the 1930s. Back in the 1930s, when the scale of the public sector was still much smaller, despite the emergency programs in response to mass unemployment. At that time, Keynes raised the concern that on its own, the private sector was perhaps not capable of generating sustained, full employment, high growth demand, and that what he called a somewhat comprehensive socialization of investment might be necessary. Now, these were fighting words at the time. And today, they're fighting words, the socialization of the investment function. But in fact, behind the scenes, it's exactly what's happened. In 1929, the total public sector of the United States amounted to 7% of the national economy. 5% was state and local government. 2% was the federal government. It was simply incapable of absorbing and cushioning the massive contraction of the private sector under the impact of the global financial crisis that began in 1929 and peaked between 31 and 33. In 2007, even in the US, the public sector was more than 30% of the national economy. It was at a scale to maintain continuity of cash flow and income to consumers and to business when the banks froze and the financial markets froze and the private sector was hit with as great a shock as it had been 80 years before. And outside of the United States, across the rest of the developed world, of course, the public sector, state, local, and central, was on the order of 40 to 50%. The Great Depression under the conditions of small state capitalism, unemployment peaked somewhere north of 25%. 30% in Germany, that was enough to bring Hitler to power. This time around, unemployment peaked on the order of 10 to 12%, in some countries not even 10%. Political continuity was maintained, and one might say that the flip side of that was that the magnitude and extent of financial reform, of regulatory reform, was limited. It's kind of an inside joke to say that with 25% unemployment, you get Glass-Steagall, the radical reform of the banking system in 1933. With only 10% unemployment, you only get Dodd-Frank, which is the very limited, although complex, reforms that are slowly being implemented today. Now let me summarize what I've been saying in a very simple way. The processes of innovation, the processes of increasing the productive capacities of the economy on the supply side by bringing into existence new technologies and deploying them at scale and finding out what they are good for, all, however they're funded, necessarily generate waste. Efficiency, the overriding pursuit of efficiency in the allocation of resources, is the enemy of innovation. Now that's a very challenging proposition for most economists who will be teaching their students that the gold standard, what economics is about, is the optimal allocation of scarce resources to meet known, identified, quantifiable needs. As if we could know what the return of those competing investment opportunities were going to be. But excessive pursuit of efficiency does not only discourage the toleration of the necessary waste on the long-run supply side of the economy, what, in honor of the great Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter, the architect of the theory of growth through technological innovation by creative destruction, I call that Schumpeterian waste. It not only discourages the toleration of Schumpeterian waste, it also encourages the unnecessary waste when resources are unemployed because of inadequate demand, when skills atrophy and machines rust because there is not enough demand to put the economy into full gear, high growth production. What is easy to recognize should be called Keynesian waste. Simply put, in a high growth, fully employed economy, more innovative projects will be financed, and people stranded in legacy industries will be more rapidly employed in the new ones, and very much vice versa. Creative destruction will be more creative and less destructive. So austerity joins efficiency as the enemy of innovation. Okay, where are we now? Where are we now in the evolution of the innovation economy? Now, there are two debates that have been launched in the last year or so, which have great significance and require, I think, exploration as a framing mechanism to understand where we are. And then there's a third dimension beyond those two debates that I'm going to turn to when I close. The first debate is initiated by a great economist, Robert Gordon at Northwestern University, great historian of economics and a great macroeconomist. And he argues that we've had three great industrial revolutions since the 18th century. The first one beginning around 1750 with steam engines, cotton industry, textiles, railroads. The second, even more important, when science was mobilized through electricity, the internal combustion engine, running water, that these two great industrial revolutions each took at least 100 years for their full effects to be recognized. And then we have our pathetic, limping, little wimpy third industrial revolution, the computer and internet revolution, which, beginning in 1960, is already over. And because it's over, we can't expect technological innovation to offset the four headwinds that the US and other mature economies face, the US perhaps more than others. One is the demographic shift with an aging population, fewer hours of work available. Educational attainment, we've sort of peaked. We've actually, in the US, begun to slide back in terms of graduates from higher education, and arguably the quality below the top level, the elite level of higher education, and inequality, which of course has reached a peak not previously seen since 1929. He also argues that we're going to have to pay down the government debt, and that means we're going to have to raise taxes, and that will be another headwind. And then he adds, in his original version, he emphasized the death of technological innovation as a source of growth. Here he says we don't even need to worry about it, but oh, by the way, it's already slowed down, so we don't have to take it into account. It's not going to be a change in the future. Now, this is his little calculation that suggests that on a long-term basis, going forward, the US is going to move from 2% annual growth, as we had for 100 years, more than 100 years, in per capita income, to 0.2%. An order of decimal magnitude reduction in the rate of growth in per capita income. The first problem with Gordon's argument was pretty evident when he just summarized the three industrial revolutions, giving the first two more than 100 years to play out, and truncating the digital revolution, the computer revolution, at barely 50 years, less than 50 years. Now, if you truncated the railroad age, if you cut it off 50 years from when the first railroads in North America began to be built, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, you would actually have wound up ending the railroad age and the economic significance of the railroad age before the founding of the Sears Roebuck Company, before the invention of the killer app of the railroad age, mail order retail. That's what created national markets, particularly across the vast spaces of North America. It's what created national brands. I'm not sure of how it worked in Canada, but I'd be surprised if it wasn't the same as in the United States. In 1880, every town had a shoemaker. By 1920 in the United States, all the shoes in the country were made in Brockton, Massachusetts. You made your own soap in 1880. By 1900, you bought from Procter & Gamble. National brand, national distribution. And more than 50 to 75 years beyond the onset of the railroad age. If you take the revolution by electrification, and kill it 50 years after Thomas Edison turned on the first generating station in downtown New York in 1882, you'd be at a time when manufacturing was only partially electrified, when unit motors that enabled machines to be moved around, when the revolution in manufacturing productivity had barely begun, and when household appliances were still extremely rare. In fact, there's ample momentum in the private sector for driving forward the digital new economy as computation becomes like electricity. Plug it in and it's there. Cycles and storage. And as the devices in your pockets have far greater capacity than stable, fixed machines had only 10 years ago, let alone in the earlier period. You're learning how to take advantage of the mobile cloud architecture of ubiquitous computing and the progressive digitization of the physical analog world I don't think we're even halfway to learning how to do that and what it's going to mean. And there's also a measurement challenge, a very substantial measurement challenge. And that is that these services that are being delivered disappear from the national income accounts. Whatever value Twitter is generating doesn't count. It's uncountable in the national income statistics. Thinking about what growth and productivity means in this new world is very challenging, especially as much of this work is being done by us, not by people who are being paid and counted previously and are being enabled by leveraging very small numbers of people, but for outputs that are extremely difficult to measure. This is an effort by a great economist at MIT, Eric Brynjolfsson, written a new book called The Second Machine Age, which begins to address this, a first exercise in trying to put some sort of estimate of value. But this doesn't appear, nothing like this appears in the GDP statistics. So the conclusion is very simple. The digital revolution is not over. It's a long way from running its course. But now on the demand side of the macroeconomy, there's also a debate taking place. And it echoes Keynes's concern of the 1930s. Larry Summers, not a shy man, and in fact, a great economist. Larry Summers raised this at a meeting at the IMF last autumn, when he suggested that this forgotten bugbear, this notion of secular stagnation, of the private sector being inadequate in generating demand that puts people to work and generates growth, might be a problem we had to think about, that we had to perhaps even worry about, particularly when we looked back over the last 20 years and saw the extent to which demand and growth had been driven, first by the productive tech bubble, and then by the highly unproductive housing bubble. Unsustainable extensions of demand, in the absence of which growth would have been much slower and employment would have been much less. And Paul Krugman, also not a shy man, not only, as is his wont, was quick to say, this is exactly what I've been saying, since Paul Krugman is someone who very rarely yields precedent and priority to anybody else, but he quite normally, appropriately notes that not only is it a possibility that the private sector might be inadequate in generating full employment growth and creating an environment for innovation. It's that this is the kind of situation where Keynes's concern actually requires extraordinary response. Now, Keynes, in the general theory, Keynes had a provocation. This is classic Keynes. Make an argument in such a way that is impossible to avoid. Don't dress it up in equations. Don't put it into math. Suggest that if you want to put people to work, the simplest thing the government can do, if it can't do anything else, if it's not allowed to make new productive investments because they're going to be evaluated for not being sufficiently efficient, well, you could take old banknotes, put them in empty beer bottles, bury them in abandoned mines, pour municipal garbage upon them, and then tell the world where they were. And then the profit-seeking motive of the private sector would put people to work, digging up the bottles, getting the cash, and spending it. And that would put money into people's pockets. It would increase consumption. Increased consumption would pull increased investment by corporations. And it might not be the best investment the government could make, but versus leaving resources unemployed, leaving people and machines whose marginal productivity as unemployed resources is negative, it would be better than doing nothing. And that's what Krugman was arguing. Well, Keynes, back in the 30s, lost this argument. He lost this argument on terms that were set forth very precisely by his protege. Hubert Henderson was Keynes's protege, both in the public and the private realm, in government, advisory boards, in the journalism and as an assistant in his own economic writing. And Henderson privately, first wrote Keynes a letter as the Depression was deepening and Keynes was pushing for government programs of spending to put people back to work. He said, be careful. You can shock, frighten, and terrify industrialists and investors. And the impact, the negative impact, will outweigh, will overwhelm the positive impact of the government programs, of the government spending. And then in an official document that Henderson wrote, he said that confidence is essential. Maintaining confidence, no matter what the substantive content of the program, if it frightens people in the private sector, we can't afford to do it. Well, of course, that is exactly the same argument that after the immediate shock of 2008 has paralyzed government responses across Europe and certainly in the United States. The argument from confidence has won out. And the fact is that, to go back to where I was, the mission is missing. Merely correcting not just market failure, but the failure of the market system to deliver full employment and high growth is not enough. And Keynes himself in 1940 ruefully recognized that when, first in Britain, then in the United States, and then across the world, well, of course, beginning first in Germany, mobilization for World War, full-scale, complete industrial mobilization, took unemployment in the United States from 18% to 2% in the course of 2 years. And then it became immeasurable. There's a number around 0.2% in 1942. Only in war conditions can a capitalist democracy organize expenditure on the scale necessary to make the grand experiment. Only where there is a compelling, transcendent political mission are we likely to find the base for the kind of investments that can drive growth and pull innovation from the laboratories into the economy. Now, at the same time, we have to recognize, and this is where I start to slide, I'm afraid, towards frustration out of pure analysis. We know what the next mission needs to be, and what is already being identified in many countries around the world, but not in the United States. It's building the foundations for the next new economy, the low-carbon economy, the sustainable economy. And certainly in the United States, it's stalled, even in Europe, because of the short-term economic costs associated. In Germany and in Britain, there's a pullback from the kind of state programs that encourage and sponsor and subsidize the new emergent infant industries in the alternative energy economy. In fact, we need massive upstream state investment in science, in battery technology, in photovoltaics, in all sorts of material science, which are long-term, as well as that early creative customer for the first products that come out that are not yet low cost enough to be reliable and available for commercialization. And we're going to have another measurement challenge to the extent that we do move from emphasizing, as we've done, from pursuing increased productivity of labor and shifting gears to recognizing the need to increase the productivity of carbon. Now, Gordon, whom I challenged, did correctly observe that his great second industrial revolution critically depended on political will and a commitment to using public funds for infrastructure investment. A political will that certainly is absent in the United States today, where climate deniers reject the science, and one might argue or ask as a kind of rhetorical question, do they reject the science because they really believe it's no good, or do they reject it because accepting it would legitimize an active economic role for government. Europe remains stuck in its pursuit of that oxymoronic program of expansionary fiscal austerity, that holding the public sector back long enough will sort of free up the animal spirits of underemployed industries. So today it's obviously China's option. Now, I was in Shenzhen last autumn. As I mentioned over lunch, I made the logistical error of going from New York to Princeton by way of Shenzhen. It's not the most direct route, but it was fascinating because I was there immediately after the new regime, the new President Li, had stated that the mission for China is to construct the first sustainable economy in the world. And everybody had gotten the memo. Whether they were public sector or private sector, academic, government, investor, industrialist, everybody said the same thing. I have no idea whether they're going to succeed. I do know that this challenge of moving from the follower, from being an effective, rapid follower to being innovative at the frontier, historically has been very, very challenging. Now, there's a story, there's a roadmap or a set of conditions set out in a book, in a major book that was published about 6 months ago by a highly visible economist at MIT named Darren Acemoglu. The book is called Why Nations Fail. It's been very, very visible. He tells a very simple linear story. First, you have to have an open political system, which therefore allows the economic system to be open, and then you can have creative destruction and experimentation on the frontier. Problem is, history doesn't read that way. When I'm in China, I like to suggest that it's worth considering a historical metaphor. In the 1820s, as Britain was becoming the leading industrial nation, it was governed by a corrupt oligarchy that exercised national authority in collaboration with a religious establishment that at the local level was unaccountable. It was enforcing a criminal code for which there were 107 crimes that, by being named felonies, were subject to death or transportation as the only immediate punishment. And they were legitimized because, looking over their shoulder, everyone could see what happened when social order broke down. The terror in Paris after the French Revolution. And they were trying to hold the lid on the greatest explosion of economic energy and financial wealth in the history of humanity. Over the next 50 years, Britain evolved by way of the Great Reform Act, the repeal of the Corn Laws, the introduction of an uncorruptible civil service, and the extension of the franchise into an open, liberal, political economy. But which came first? Was political openness driven by the economic expansion and the entry into the public sphere of new people with new money? Or was it political openness came first? It's a much more complicated story. It's the story that we are clearly going to have the opportunity to observe as to how it unfolds in China over the next generation. Now, considering this, certainly for an American, is pretty downbeat. It's not exactly a triumphant story today, given where we've been and where we've come to. But I can't end on a negative note. The fellow who hired me at Warwick Pincus some 26 years ago used to say that you couldn't survive as a venture capitalist if you're a pessimist. The environment is just so often subject to radical pain. My partner, Henry Crisell, a great physicist before he became a great venture capitalist, to say that the only law, the only mathematical law of venture capital is that grief is a constant. So temperamentally, you have to be an optimist. And now I'll tell you why I'm an optimist. There's been one dimension of the impact of the global financial crisis and the Great Recession that is unequivocally positive. It's been its impact on the academic disciplines of economics and finance. It has forced the opening of minds where the challenge is very simple. What are you going to believe? The efficient market hypothesis and rational expectations, and that the markets will always give you the right answer? Are you going to believe that, or are you going to believe your lying eyes? Are you going to believe banks closing, crisis, unemployment, the need for a radical response? So in these disciplines, and this is where Jim Belsilli and I are allies at the Institute for New Economic Thinking, economics is shifting from celebrating the efficient, optimal allocation of resources through time to recognizing that economics is really the study of coordination failures, where people operating under conditions of uncertainty, even ignorance, as they do what they can, as they think they're doing what they need to do for themselves, produce conflict and failure in coordination, not all the time, but often enough that it has to be taken seriously. Supply does not create its own demand when those who sell can hold cash rather than buy what others offer. Intended investment does not equal intended savings when those who save are not the same people as those who invest. Realized returns do not equal projected returns when investment decisions are necessarily made under conditions of uncertainty. So resources can never be expected to be optimally allocated. Financial markets are not efficient when investors cannot afford to be wrong for very long. Bubbles and crashes are inevitable. From microeconomics to macroeconomics, diverse, intensive efforts to address these realities of economic and financial life with rigor are underway, and they're enabled and accompany the reintegration of economics and finance, a divorce that had tragic consequences in 2008. Keynes famously concluded the general theory by asserting the power of ideas, that they're more powerful than commonly understood. The power of vested interests compared to the power of ideas are far greater. Sooner or later, it is ideas which are dangerous for good or evil. And what my optimistic final message is that the ideas of economists are in process of becoming substantially more dangerous for good than they have been for a long generation. Thank you very much. Now, questions. There are mics at the bottom of the two staircases, and there are some questions and volunteers standing by them. I do have some, well, I see that I've got some tweeting going on. Are there any questions from anybody on the webcast? Are there any questions here? Come on. I know Canadians are supposed to be shy, but this is Waterloo. I see. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jack Redmond. You coined Keynesian waste. Is that a new your new nomenclature?
Well, Keynesian waste I speak of as being unnecessary waste when resources are unemployed. Robert Skidelsky, Lord Skidelsky, who's Keynes's great biographer, really urged me not to use the term because it would taint Keynes. But I'm saying that Keynes recognized and spent the better part of his career fighting against the toleration of that unnecessary waste.
Okay. What do you get when you put Keynesian waste together with Chinese corruption?
Well, what you get when you have unemployed resources and Chinese corruption?
Well, let's put it this way. The waste that comes from governmental programs.
No, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about unemployment at 10 or 12% and people long-term unemployed losing the skills and losing the ability to function economically effectively. Right. Now, if you're talking about what do you get with Schumpeterian waste, okay, the waste of programs of investment that don't always work, and you put it with corruption, what you get is the history of industrialization for 250 years.
Okay. So
What you get is the history of the American railroads.
okay.
The American railroads, where we took 9% of the landmass of the lower 48, gave it to a gang of corrupt promoters, and they created the transcontinental railroads. Yep. The states, even before that, provided subsidies to the promoters who built the trunk railroad lines from the East Coast to Chicago. We built 5 of them in order to guarantee that none of them would ever make a profit. And they wound up going bankrupt, but just as with the corruption of WorldCom and the bankruptcy of WorldCom, when the stockholders lost their money, the rails were there and the fiber optic cables were there to be utilized productively afterwards.
Okay.
There is nothing new in Chinese corruption that hasn't been experienced. Now, the corruption tax clearly, on the one hand, follows wherever economic development takes place, and it can overwhelm and override, and it has in large parts of the world.
Okay, so would you predict then that between Russia and China, and maybe Mexico that have the most corruption, that at least out of those 3, there will be one great power that will create the next industrial revolution for the world?
I don't think we have to worry about being Russia. It's very hard to imagine a country where life expectancy is declining monotonically, and whose sole resource is hydrocarbons, which we should be dedicating ourselves to undercutting in terms of price and availability, is going to be a world power. China, of course, China is the question. The US in 1890 was unimaginably corrupt. Unimaginably corrupt. And it was very easy to sit in London and to, on the one hand, keep shipping the money over to America. And they did again and again and again, from funding the railroad boom of the 1850s, actually even before that, funding the state development programs, the local state development programs in the 1840s, then the railroads in the 1850s. The reason J.P. Morgan had a jump start on becoming the leading financier in the world was that his father, who was an investment banker, was the only American investment banker who actually tried to get the money back for the London investors who'd been ripped off by the corrupt American political, public and private sector entrepreneurs.
Thank you very much for your new and interesting, perverse predictability in terms of the economy.
Contrarian, I like to say. We have a question here.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. Since there's only 2 ways government can have anything to spend, one is printing and one is taxes, how do you justify what I would consider confiscation of what somebody else earns in order to provide for these public projects that you say are good?
First of all, the government can sell bonds to investors who choose to buy the bonds and without printing any money. So it certainly there are not only 2 ways. And second, that in fact has been how most government debt has been funded over very long periods of time in countries that have reached the stage where, beginning in Britain in the late 18th century, the notion of credible commitment that the government was actually going to pay the money back and pay it back in dollars or pounds that were reasonably worth something equivalent to what had been lent to them. So I don't think that government spending necessarily involves confiscation. In fact, I think that is a category error that projects the question into another realm. So it's not a question, it's a statement. Okay. Well, I don't justify government confiscation, and the good news is I don't have to.
Well, then what is taxes then?
Taxes, well, as has been said by a great political philosopher, taxes are the price we pay for civilization. Now, Esther Dyson is an extraordinary woman. I've known her for many years. She was the daughter of Freeman Dyson, the great physicist whose name at the Perimeter Institute is perhaps one of the most revered. Freeman is still very much alive. Esther, at Harvard, became fascinated with Russia and with Russian. She learned Russian. And as the things that she was actually in Russia before the wall came down, before the breakup of the Soviet Union, and then she was back there. And Esther, on the other hand, inherited one of the central convening places for everybody interested in IT for 10, 12, 15 years. It was called the Platform for Computing, the PC Conference. Began as PCs and then more broadly Platform for Communications. I'm sure Jim must have been there from time to time at Esther's conference. And she also participated, as I did, in a roundtable at Aspen, a roundtable that addressed the broader issues surrounding the IT revolution. And there were many, particularly from Silicon Valley, who were what you might call card-carrying, committed libertarians, who did believe, contrary to what I've said about the role of the state in building a platform on which they danced, the role of DARPA, the role of the Office of Naval Research, fundamentally believed that everything useful had been done entirely through their own efforts, and that government existed solely to screw up efficient markets and to confiscate the rewards that were rightfully theirs. And I'll never forget, Esther had come back from Russia in about 1992. She had a long trip, and she gave a little talk about what it's like to live in a capitalist society in which the rule of law, and no one believes that the tax that represents the price of civilization is something that either has to be paid or needs to be paid. It was a jungle. It was a jungle. And so they've moved to a different direction where confiscation indeed is the way of life. Ask Mr. Korakovsky. So I would not try to pursue this line of thought much further, except to say that I respectfully disagree.
Okay.
Thanks. Now I want to go to the web, where we have a really interesting question. This is a really important question, and it actually is a question that I, over the last 2 months, have become deeply engaged in trying to comprehend. The question is, can you comment on digital currencies such as Bitcoin and the evolution of the innovation economy? Do open currencies have the potential to change the global economic system? Now, I'm going to address this in a way that may begin by sounding indirect. Bitcoin is a phenomenon that has attracted the attention and has brought focus to two very different communities. One, monetary historians and monetary economists who have a deep knowledge and understanding of how currencies have evolved, how monetary systems have emerged, how they have failed, broken, redeveloped, how they persistently have required the development of governmental institutions to provide lender of last resort to the intermediaries that are necessary, to designate what means of payment will qualify as legal tender in the payment of all debts, public and private, as it says on every dollar bill ever printed. That community, and another community, the community of computer scientists, of deep, serious computer scientists. And there's no point of tangency between the two. There's no conversation, at least until we at INET bring one about in the next several months, which is what I'm working on. The computer scientists assert with real conviction and authority that Bitcoin is just one application of a profound breakthrough deep in computer networks, a breakthrough that has been addressed without success for some 30 years or more. Now stay with me. The problem that Bitcoin represents, possibly, though clearly a less than fully adequate solution to, is the problem that's usually referred to by the computer science guys in language that the monetary historians have no idea what it means, as the Byzantine generals problem. Now, this has a very technical meaning. The story is that you've got 3 Byzantine generals, Byzantine because it's a great word and it sounds mysterious. 3 Byzantine generals. If they all attack at the same time, they win. They win. and they get a message to attack. But how do they know it's legitimate? How do they know that one of them isn't perhaps a traitor who sent it to the other two to get them to attack, to get wiped out, so that the survivor will be the ultimate heir to power? Well, underneath Bitcoin is a set of processes which are very public. And by the way, anonymity is not one of the attributes of Bitcoin, through which the work of people on the net devoting computing resources to a technical challenge of validating a message that says, Carol is sending 10 Bitcoins to Bob, that message really is from Carol and it's really going to Bob. And they do it through cryptographic, crypto security techniques involving, don't have to go much further on this, public and private codes, which are mashed up in such a way that unmashing them requires real work. And if enough of them validate the transaction, it's considered to be confirmed. Now, if this really works, that you can validate a transaction without any third party authenticating who is talking to whom, this does have profound significance. The fact that Bitcoin is clearly subject to being hacked, that it's how shall we put it, attracted scoundrels and scam artists like honey attracts bees, will fade into insignificance, and there will be some sort of follow-on implementation. And that's when the computer science guys are going to have to meet the monetary historians. And they will discover that it's at the interface between any currency, any means of payment, and the rest of the world. That's where the trouble is. It's when a bank is converting dollar bills into bank accounts or vice versa, underwriting that process. Every intermediary in a financial system is subject to a run. And the only way to protect against run is having access to someone whose credit is unquestioned, because it has the power to tax, whose credit is unquestioned and can underwrite the liabilities of the intermediary. So Bitcoin or its successor will meet the regulators, and actually the most farsighted, I would say, responsible, people like Mark Andreessen, you know his name, the venture capitalist, who's very much involved in this. They're basically saying we need to explore this interface between this new, we believe, breakthrough in computer networking and the regulatory environment in order to enable digital means of payment, among other applications, to prosper and proliferate. So I think Bitcoin is a fascinating phenomenon, but it's the superstructure. It's the top of the iceberg. And it's what's going on beneath the surface that really is interesting. So I think you should actually take seriously, and don't just say, Bitcoins are the new tulip bulbs, they're going to blow up and go away. Something more important is going on here. It's a long-winded answer to what I think is a really important question. Now there's someone else here, because I've got another question. So over here, yes, sir. That's quite a question.
Hello. So today, so basically, a main message today is that there needs to be more government involvement and incentives in the economy for innovation to take off again. But my question is that, is there a threshold or a limit, I guess, in your opinion, for the involvement of government?
Well, I think it's not just that of course there's a limit, but it's also modes of involvement really matter. Now, I drew a distinction, I may have passed over it too quickly. I drew a distinction of the approach that the agencies of the United States government, and the Defense Department in particular, took in the early years of the digital economy, where on the one hand, they seeded the private sector with research funding. A lot of it went to the big companies as well as to the research universities. But when they bought stuff, they bought from the little new companies. In fact, in 1959, this stuck with me, it's a representative year of this period, almost 70% of all the research dollars went to the big guys, went to AT&T and IBM. Whereas almost 70% of all the devices were purchased from the Intels and the Texas Instruments, the new players. Now this is the opposite of what took place in Europe. Britain was unequivocally the leader in computing at the end of World War II, unequivocally. But they chose to go the route of picking a national champion, requiring that the government agencies only buy computers from ICL, making it easy for ICL to sell, so easy that it proved completely incompetent in trying to sell into competitive commercial international markets. It was a doomed program, and it is the case that government picking winners for the commercial markets versus at the scientific stage of seeding and creating a reservoir of accessible technology and then inviting new players to draw on that reservoir and offer new products, new solutions, new applications. So it's not just a question of how much the government does, it's how it does it. Now we can even take this forward to the embarrassment of the Obama administration in its loan program for alternative energy companies. Now, you can understand the temptation to which the administration succumbed in January 1909. It has an economy that is in free fall, as in Canada, a banking system that is frozen, and it does have a limited window in which to invoke Keynes's provocation to stimulate the private sector and save the private sector from itself. So it's putting together a program with multiple different kinds of projects. And they find this loan guarantee program that actually had begun under George W. Bush. And they expand it massively. And they make loans, they guarantee loans to all sorts of startups. One of them was Tesla that paid the money back. But one of them was a company called Solyndra in solar cells. One of them was a battery company out of MIT called A123. They had promising technology. But what the Obama administration did, from one perspective, stimulating demand, made all the sense in the world. Any venture capitalist can tell you, if you want to get money spent, give it to a startup. I promise you it'll be spent. But on the longer term, increase the supply potential. This was the opposite of what should have been done. It was the opposite of what the Defense Department did in the 50s and 60s. Instead, they could have said, anybody who can produce batteries that are this efficient, or solar cells, we'll buy some, we'll test them. If they work, we'll put them on some army barracks, we'll put them into army trucks, we'll drive them around the Mojave Desert for 6 months, we'll buy some more. We'll pull you down the learning curve to low-cost, reliable production so they become available to the commercial market. That's the approach that really worked and was distinctively, if not uniquely, implemented in the 50s and 60s in the US and is available for copying. I don't know whether the Chinese are in that mode at this point. It's possible that corruption could block it. That's where the corruption tax can be really punitive if the big guys, the big incumbents, are able to control the procurement process and keep the new entrants out. We have another question from next door in Kitchener, which is a really good question, Jim. This is one that I think you will resonate with. With waste inherent in innovation and grief a mainstay in venture capitalism, as a VC, was there a common characteristic that you would look for in an entrepreneur to minimize both? Well, there was more than one common characteristic. There were several. First of all, I have to say I was really drawn to entrepreneurs who had been through previously a failed startup and or a near-death experience of a major business, preferably both. Now that's not what I only wanted. I wanted other experience too. But you wanted to know people who had survived under stress. That's one. Second, looking for people who actually, who might be brilliant engineers, but who actually took customers seriously. So there was a question that took me about 15 years to learn to ask in meeting an entrepreneur with a great idea and a business plan. And that was to say, tell me again, exactly whose problem are you going to solve? Oh, and by the way, how many other people are there like that person whose problem you're going to solve? And by the way, do they have budgets? Are you likely to actually get orders from them? And if the entrepreneur said, look, it doesn't matter. What I've got is so great, it's going to sell itself. Ralph Waldo Emerson was wrong. You build the best mousetrap in the world, and the world will not be a path to your door. I promise you. So that, a sense of the market, surviving stress, and then I guess the final thing is recognizing that as my mentor in the early days of my career, my mentor was an extraordinary guy who was really a turnaround artist more than he was a venture capitalist, although he functioned as a venture capitalist. And he had pillows made up with needlepoint, embroidered pillows. He used to throw them at people. And the motto on the pillow was, corporate happiness is positive cash flow, where you're paying your debts not by raising more money, not by being dependent on the kindness of financial speculators who may or may not be interested in what you're doing, may or may not be in a bubble mode. You're paying your bills because customers are paying you money for what you're doing for them. And that money is actually more than the cost of delivering the good or service that you're offering. So being sensitive to positive cash flow as the wellspring of corporate happiness would be the third characteristic. Yes?
Hi. So part of the problem, as I understand it, with economics in the move towards focusing on efficiency was a quantitative focus on mathematization and looking at physics as an inspiration. So in this new focus on innovation economics, what are the mathematical inspirations? Is it complexity, dynamical systems, or computing, or anything?
That's a really good question. It's a really good question. And, you know, in a way, one of the things, in fact, I'm supposed to do an interview in the next couple of days on mathematics and economics, because there is a view, and it's a very broad view, that what went wrong with economics was it became all math. My attitude is not like that at all. My attitude is that bad mathematical models are bad, but not all mathematical models are bad. And that in fact, the more realistic you make the assumptions, the harder the math is going to be. The reason that these models look so trivial and so obviously misleading is that the math 50 years ago, when these canonical models were established, only allowed for very simplistic assumptions. The assumption that everybody has fixed preferences, and all those preferences, by the way, never change over time, even under experience. That you could actually go one step further. What I would call the radically irrational rational expectations hypothesis. Everybody knows everything there is to know. Everybody has the same model for what it means, and the model happens to be true. Now, if you believe that, you can produce a macroeconomic model which is based upon the behavior of one representative agent who is optimizing her utility, faced with a producer who is efficiently allocating his resources. And you can scale that all the way up to the national economy. By the way, note that if you only have one representative agent, you have no financial system. Any loans and debts are eliminated. So these were the models. I'm not kidding. This sounds ridiculous. These models were dominant right up into the crisis in 2008 in every central bank, in every treasury. They were models in which it was logically and existentially impossible for anything that happened in the financial system to affect the rate of unemployment, to affect the rate of production, to affect consumption. Logically impossible. Well, that's what, as I say, that's why I'm an optimist, because of what 2008 did to that lunacy. Now, as you get more complicated, as you think about people with different endowments, different preferences, different access to information, it gets really complicated. And that's where a good deal of the work we're funding at INET is about the rediscovery of saying, okay, we're not going to produce a nice, clean, simple, analytical solution that demonstrates where this is the conditions in which we have a sustainable equilibrium. We're going to explore this space with simulation models, with computer simulation models, just the way the natural scientists are exploring the incredibly complex biological systems or the physical systems. But here it's even more complex because guess what? Molecules aren't conscious of each other's behavior or even of their own, and human beings are, and they react to each other. So I think there's a great future in the development and the extension of new methodological approaches for exploring these complex financial and economic systems, and it's begun to be accepted that this is a legitimate way to do economics and to do finance, and that is a really good thing. So, oh, I'm sorry, sir.
It's all right. But one of the key messages that you provide both in your book and your presentation today is that we need to be revitalising state-based research and development funding without an understanding of what the future economic return is, and have faith in the basic science and research process to produce the innovation of tomorrow. So my question to you is how do we build the political support to accept that? Because this is one of the core issues, that even if it appears as a good policy to governments, how do they execute it without the political support behind it?
Well, there's a term that, there's a number of books have been written, a number of academic studies of how this dynamic emerged after World War II. And there's no question that the role of the political entrepreneur, as distinct from the economic entrepreneur, the commercial entrepreneur, is absolutely central. There's a great applied mathematician, he's actually a geophysicist, at the ETH, in Zurich, the equivalent of the, sort of the Institute for Advanced Study in Zurich, named Didier Sornet. And Sornet kind of made his bones by analyzing seismic data, looking for patterns that would predict earthquakes. And then he took this model where you began to see, just before, as the risk of earthquake increased, you saw a lot of volatility, very short bursts of volatility, and then increasingly. And he applied that to the stock market, and he found the same kind of patterns in the stock market. Well, he's now working on, he's got a research program, which I think is great. I think it's enormously ambitious. He's got a lot of work to do. But he's trying to work on the notion of social bubbles, political bubbles. How did it come about that the United States people, the United States public, celebrated taking, in today's money, maybe $300 billion, maybe 400, and going to the moon? Project Apollo. What was that about? In 1962, President Kennedy presented it as a challenge. Clearly, it had something to do with the Soviet challenge, with Sputnik, with the risk, perceived risk of the Soviets taking leadership. It was obviously, economists would say, a signaling device that the US, there's no limit to how much money we will, quote, waste on a project, the economic return from which, oh yeah, we got Tang, and we did get some push towards micro miniaturization of microelectronics, but because this was human beings, they were actually using very old, by those standards, computing technology. The new stuff was in the Minuteman missile guidance system, where you didn't have to worry, you weren't trying to save lives. So Sornet has actually done an analysis of the circumstances under which a national mission was defined, which legitimized this massive investment over a decade, over a dozen years. And then, of course, it tailed off. And it happened to tail off more or less coincident with the rise of market fundamentalism and the notion that, by definition, nothing the government did could possibly be economically productive. And if it weren't economically productive, there was no justification for it whatsoever. That's where, of course, we start talking again about the next mission, about low carbon. In the meantime, there's a very relevant question that's just come up, if you want to put it up on the big screen, which is, what role can space exploration companies, can private sector investment in space have in a sustainable innovation economy? Well, I guess the first thing is to say that SpaceX, Blue Origin, and Virgin Galactic are not going to reduce the carbon footprints of the people riding the rockets into space. I think we can be pretty sure about that. Now, there certainly are visionaries, some with their own money, like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, who's basically built a space base in Texas. There are visionaries with other people's money. Sir Richard Branson is a fabulous at deploying other people's money for his brand. This is a very long-term proposition. It is imaginable, and you know, when I was a kid, I really loved science fiction. And I guess now I'm definitely going to show my age. I'm definitely going to show my age. When I was 16 years old, I spent the summer the way 16-year-olds are really not thrilled about spending their summer. I spent it in the hospital for special surgery in plaster from my chest to my knees because I had to have a spinal fusion. I read a lot of science fiction, and there was this wonderful novel, which I'll never forget. The title was The Light in the Sky Are Stars, and it was written by Frederick Brown, and it was set in the unimaginably distant future, 1999, when private enterprise, entrepreneurs funded by the stock market had established not just a space station, but a colony on the moon, and were reaching toward Mars. And this was the new frontier. This was the opening of the American West. This was building the trunk railroad. This was private enterprise creating not just a next new economy, but a next new geography. And I was absolutely thrilled. And you know, I'm still waiting for it. I think that these kinds of demonstration projects, I'm actually much more impressed with what Musk is doing with his electric car, with the Tesla, than with the SpaceX. He's demonstrating in SpaceX that he can do stuff much more cheaply sitting on the shoulders of NASA, because he's leveraging these $400 billion now, accumulating now since we stopped going to the moon by another $300 or $400 billion. He's basically sitting on the shoulders of $1 trillion of NASA stuff, being able to select out of what NASA did what is relevant today. And that's fine. And he's going to deliver cheaper rockets for private and public purposes, mostly satellites. We're not going to the Mars on SpaceX. So I think that's just fine. But the electric car is really interesting because it's the one venture that is enjoying the inestimable benefit of a grotesque overvaluation of the stock price, which actually involves building something, making something, and demonstrating an alternative technology which will reduce the carbon footprint, particularly if the electricity is generated not by burning coal, right? And there he's had the wit to do the right thing when you're blessed with a grotesquely overvalued stock. You buy cash. And he's just bought $2 billion more worth of cash at a $50 billion market valuation for a company with $500 million in revenue and no profits. So he has a shot. But at the least, it's a demonstration project for the big auto companies that something's going on here that they better respond to. So for that, I really applaud him. Fred?
few comments before we adjourn. First of all, I want to thank Bill Janeway for his stimulating, really wonderful lecture this evening. Bill, you laid out the economic history of innovation, the path for continuing investments in innovation, and the important roles of both private capital and the state. And amid radical uncertainty, the necessity of creative waste and error on the road to success. I found it fascinating, I'm sure everyone did, and it was radically interesting, I'd have to say. Thank you very much. Last couple of comments. An edited video of Dr. Janeway's address will be posted to the CG website. We'll also post a blog about this event where you can add your own comments. Our next public event in the CG Auditorium is coming up quickly. Next Thursday, March 13th, Natalie Day, head of policy at the Oxford Martin School, will discuss a global call to action based on findings from the Oxford Martin Commission for Future Generations report, called Now for the Long Term report that she helped to write. And then on Tuesday, March 18th, CG welcomes Omar Samad. He's a former ambassador of Afghanistan to Canada and senior Central Asia fellow at the New America Foundation. He'll be discussing the future of Afghanistan now that the Canadian, US, and British militaries are leaving. So be sure to register for these events in our events newsletter to receive information on all of our upcoming lectures, including our CG Cinema series. Thank you again for coming tonight. Remember to pick up a copy of Dr. Janeway's book in the lobby. He'll sign it for you, and have a safe journey home.
Every year, more than 80% of all the dollars invested by members of the National Venture Capital Association in the United States have been invested in only two industrial sectors: information and communications technology, the digital sector, and biotechnology, life sciences. Those happen to be the two sectors where, over the previous generation, the federal government had invested literally hundreds of billions of dollars constructing platforms on which entrepreneurs and the venture capitalists who backed them could dance. It also is the case that the VC industry emerged, grew, thrived, prospered during the greatest bull market in the history of capitalism, between 1982 and the blow-off of the great dot-com telecom bubble in the year 2000. You can see here the extraordinary inflation in the number of firms and in the amount of capital committed to those firms that moved in step with the growth of the bull market into the speculative explosion of the bubble of 1998-2000. And then you can also see what has happened since. In fact, venture capital returns are very closely correlated with the performance of the public equity markets. They are not an independent asset class. What I'm showing you here is called the PME, the public market equivalent. This is constructed, and it's now the standard way of evaluating every private equity fund, from startup venture to buyouts. You look at the historical record of a fund. You look at the pattern by which money was put into the fund from limited partners, pension funds, insurance companies, and when the money came back to the limited partners. And then you take the same amount of money on the same day and put it in the public stock market index, where you have complete liquidity and you're part of the overall market. What this shows is that for the 200 funds that I and my collaborator studied, funds in which, all of the funds in which two of the leading research universities had invested since 1980, funds that collectively were substantially better than the total industry average, that it looks like the average return from these funds was 1.6 times what you would have got from the public market. But when you take out the small number of highest performing funds
the top decile, the top 20, you would have done just as well investing in the public market. And if you look at the median firm, the one that's 50% right in the middle of the distribution, you'd have done just as well investing in the index. Now that's the cross-section over 25 years of venture capital investing. And it also, we showed that it was access to the public market, to a public market that was animated, that really made the difference to fund performance. Here we're looking at taking each of the funds we studied, we're weighting them according to what the conditions were in the IPO market when the funds exited. If the conditions were poor, like they have been for the last 14 years, that is less than 2 in our scale, the median return was 9%. When we were in the bubble environment, better than 3, it was no less than 76%. The venture returns were not independent of the public market conditions, and this shows the time series returns in the same way. That's again the public market equivalent. During the bubble, the weighted average returns were extraordinary. You were doing 2 to 3 to 3.5 times as well as the public market. But when the bubble collapsed and the IPO market closed, since funds raised in 1996, this line shows that you actually would have done better investing in the public stock market index than investing in the venture capital funds. Venture capital is not the magic bullet, which, independent of either government investments beforehand or public market speculation at the time of the investing, it's not an independent source of driving innovation. It's embedded. Now, let me take a look at the, oh, by the way, this just confirms, these are the venture capital index calculated for the National Venture Capital Association versus the NASDAQ. And you can see that you have to go back 15 years. You have to go back to 1999 to see outperformance of venture capital at the time of
and Princeton University. I think Waterloo and CG is in very good company in challenging and creating an environment for interesting and provocative dialogue. And I hope that's what I can provoke this evening. So let me begin by suggesting that what I learned by doing capitalism is going to have a broader resonance with respect to how we think about the dynamics of the innovation economy. So the first question is, what do I mean by the innovation economy? I mean a set of processes through which economic development has been driven by technological innovation for some 250 years. Upstream, processes of scientific discovery, technical experimentation. Downstream, the exploration of new economic space as hopeful monsters in a kind of Darwinian mode spring up in the soil that is created when new technologies are deployed at scale. And both of these processes, this is critical, both of these processes proceed by trial and error and error and error. In between, the technologies that really matter, that reconfigure the architecture of the market economy, have been embedded in transformational networks, networks of infrastructure from the canals and railroads of the first industrial revolution through the electricity grids and highways of the second great wave of technological transformation and onto the internet. Networks whose value and use cannot be known at the outset of deployment. Now, all three of these phases depend on sources of funding, necessarily sources of funding that are decoupled from an immediate concern for economic value. And there are two such sources, two reservoirs of capital available for these kinds of investments: financial speculation, bubbles, and a mission-driven, politically legitimate state. Now, despite the heroic myths of Silicon Valley, the history of United States venture capital illustrates exactly what I've been saying. From 1980, when something resembling an industry emerged from what had been a small craft practice scattered across from Boston, around Boston and New York, when an industry emerged, since then, in every
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Center for International Governance Innovation, or CG as we say. My name is Fred Kuntz. I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs here at CG. I'd like to thank our public event sponsor, Wordsworth Books, for their ongoing support of CG's signature lecture series. Thanks also to those joining us from around the world through our live webcast. Following this evening's address, we welcome questions from the audience, either the live audience here at our microphones in the aisles, or from our online audience through the chat function on your screen. Please remember to state your name and to keep the questions brief. Investing without concern for your return may sound like weak financial advice. But as venture capitalist and economist William Janeway may explain this evening, an innovation economy depends on this kind of risk. Successful ideas are often found in the midst of costly failures, mistakes, and missteps. An innovation economy depends on long-term visionaries prepared to invest today in an idea that may not yield any gains in their lifetime. Tonight we'll hear more about the innovation economy and the investments it requires. Dr. Janeway is currently a senior advisor at the private equity firm Warburg Pincus and director of Magnet Systems, Nuance Communications, and O'Reilly Media. He also lends his time and expertise to several economic organizations, sitting on the executive board of the Social Science Research Council, the Cambridge Endowment for Research and Finance, which he and his wife Wesley established in 2001, and the board of CG's long-term partner, the Institute for New Economic Thinking, to name a few. Dr. Janeway is also a respected economic writer, authoring chapters and articles on capitalism and social research, and most recently writing the book, Doing Capitalism in the Innovation Economy, Markets, Speculation, and the State, which forms the basis for his lecture this evening, and also will be available for purchase later in the foyer. He'll be glad to sign a copy for you. Dr. Janeway is a pioneer and a generous supporter of economic research, a friend of CG. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished guest, Bill Janeway.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you, Jim. And let me tell you what a pleasure it is to be here. It has been one of the most enjoyable and stimulating days I've spent in many a time, and that's despite, that's in competition with teaching some of what, or perhaps a superset of what you'll hear tonight, over the last several months at Cambridge University.
The peak of the Great Bubble versus the public market. Speculation and the state, the two sources of funding for innovation. Now, let me put this into a broader perspective. Bubbles didn't begin in 1998. Wherever there have been liquid markets and assets for hundreds of years, going back to Amsterdam and tulip bulbs in the 1630s, Britain and the South Sea Company in 1720, wherever there have been liquid markets, there you will find herding behavior, momentum investing, and the opportunity for financial speculation to create an environment in which capital can flow rapidly back and forth from the public markets to the real economy where investment in real assets takes place. John Maynard Keynes, and in some sense I am an intellectual descendant of his, I studied at Cambridge under his leading student, in his general theory, Keynes had an insight which has been lost to economics and is now in the process of being rediscovered. It's what I call Keynes's bridge. The valuation of financial assets drives the movement of the volume of investment in real assets. When financial assets appear to be undervalued, there's no sense, as he put it, in building a new enterprise if you can buy a similar one on the public market. That's the leverage buyout game. And contrariwise, a new project, you might spend an extravagant sum if you can take it public, as we could in 1998, 99, 2000, at an immediate profit. Now, the underlying way that bubbles, financial speculation, mobilizes capital at a scale for risky projects, for projects whose return cannot be known, for innovative networks, and for the hopeful monsters that grow up that are founded to exploit those networks, those new economic spaces. The motivation is simple. Investors, particularly professional investors managing other people's money, cannot afford to miss the wave. And they have the opportunity, they can believe that they can win even if the underlying project fails, that there will be a more enthusiastic, a more speculative investor in the market. And they can hope to get out before they have to find out whether what they've funded has any economic value. Now, the objects of speculation stagger the imagination. They range across an enormous spectrum.